Hi, this is Andrea Hyde, and I'm here to talk to you about contemplative inquiry and qualitative research in education. I've been using qualitative research techniques for at least 10 years now. I started as a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh, collecting interview data from teachers about their philosophies of education. And I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years now and have added a daily meditation practice in just the past 3 years. I've also been taking training in how to teach yoga to young people in school environments, to adults, and in how to teach mindfulness techniques to young people in school environments. I teach a free adult yoga class on the Quad Cities campus, and my active research has to do with how yoga programs in school settings influence the behavioral atmosphere of the school. But as a qualitative researcher, I'm really open to learning anything and everything that I can about what is happening in the yoga and mindfulness in schools movement. So that's my basic research question. And I use contemplative inquiry, in particular mindfulness techniques such as breathing and paying attention to sensations in the body, and yoga as a way to prepare myself for research, to sit with the data, to operate ethically with my participants, and to write and prepare for writing and editing scholarship and research reports. Take a look at some of the quotes that I've selected for you to think about as you're considering this information. The first quote is by Pema Chodron, who's an American Buddhist nun. She's a popular writer for Shambhala Press. She says, "The most fundamental aggression to ourselves, the most fundamental harm we can do to ourselves, is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently." And this quote reminds us that there is a lot to be learned from studying the self, from directing inquiry inwardly. And we know this intuitively. We know that there's a lot going on underneath the surface, but we've been socialized in modern Western societies to think of inquiry as directed at something or someone outside of ourselves. So contemplative inquiry, paired with qualitative research, provides us with paradigms, philosophies, and exercises that we can use to direct our inquiry inward into the processes that are happening continuously. And these are processes that inform our research topics and attitudes, ethics, the methods we use, and the claims that we make about our findings. The second quote is from a colleague from the Mindfulness in Education Network, Alan Donsky. He's a professor of psychiatry. And he wrote as part of our listserv, "Science is not the only lens or paradigm by which we measure our lives. Science never was and never will be needed to validate the humanistic aspects of our experience, such as kindness, compassion, mindfulness, forgiveness, alacrity, wisdom, heartfulness, joy, sorrow, elation, and awe. I like this piece because it offers a response to the idea that the gold standard in research for all of the social sciences should be random controlled trials, just like we use in natural or biomedical kinds of research. So this is a statement in support of qualitative research and in inquiry that is beyond research. It's support for other ways of knowing, and in particular, it supports the idea that science is a poor tool for investigating some of the most human qualities. And I think it's appropriate in both cases to think about inquiry into internal phenomenon and inquiry into the humanistic processes for studies involving education. So here's an overview of what I've assembled for you. I'll first explain what is contemplative inquiry, especially as it's been situated in education. What are the practices of contemplative inquiry? Why we might use contemplative inquiry in educational environments. I'll share with you some applications of contemplative inquiry, especially in dissertation work. I'll provide some resources for you, and after the presentation, there'll be a video for you on just one mindfulness practice. This slide is about contemplative inquiry, provides a definition, and connects contemplative inquiry to qualitative research. So as a rather young but old field, contemplative inquiry has a few definitions, but in principle, it resists any strong central definition, so it's open for interpretation, and as more people talk about the field, you'll see more definitions coming up. But for your purposes, I'm happy to make these few statements about contemplative inquiry. It's the application of contemplative methods or practices to inquiry projects, the practice of contemplative techniques by the researcher, and the use of contemplative ethics as a guide for conduct of research, ways to be with participants. So that's methods for the inquiry project, techniques that the researcher uses themselves, and a set of ethics for the conduct of research. Now, how does that connect to other qualitative research components? First of all, it's a particular way of knowing, and the branch of philosophy that studies knowing is called epistemology. So you might hear about the epistemological position or approach of a qualitative research project. And we usually think of that as being either objectivist, constructivist, or subjectivist. But that's more a statement about how knowledge is constructed. Here, epistemology is used as a way to organize three ways of knowing: the rational the sensory empirical and the contemplative. So the rational is the way of knowing of the classical philosophers, and philosophy was the master science that gave way to investigative science that we know now. So as we moved from thinking through things using logic to come to know, we moved into gathering information. When you hear the term empirical, you think of data being gathered. And that can be interview data as well as fossils and cells and saliva samples. So the second way of knowing is the sensory empirical. And the third way of knowing is the contemplative. And the reason that I say that contemplative inquiry is a new but old field is that contemplation has a place in our ancient wisdom traditions. So contemplative knowing has to do with being interested and curious and receptive. It's being both active and passive. It's being curious without making judgment about something. So we think of study in the broadest sense. For example, the study of a painting as a way to get to know it intimately. And from that, we welcome knowledge. We're ready for knowledge. We're ready for a knowing relationship. It's actually a continuous way of knowing. So the third person is the objective stance. And sometimes if you're reading research, and most of the time if you're reading research from the medical sciences, you'll see that the researcher uses the third person voice, and that's meant to be objective. You might hear the second person voice to acknowledge that there are human beings involved, human beings that are being studied or asked about their experiences. And this is where a constructive or constructivist epistemology comes into play. So you are the person that I'm interested in talking about, and I might name you as the person. But when we think of first-person inquiry into ourselves, that is utterly subjective. And in traditional kinds of research, we are highly suspect of anything that is subjective. We equate subjectivism with something being unfair, tainted. But in first-person critical investigation, we are the only ones capable of conducting this kind of inquiry. And of course it's going to be subjective, and in here and in all of qualitative research, that's not a negative thing. So why do we say contemplative inquiry instead of research? Well, we're distancing this kind of practice from that objective third-person kind of position and from the idea of traditional scientific research. But inquiry is something broader than research. So while all research is a kind of inquiry, a kind of investigation, inquiry includes less systematic study. So, for example, some journalistic investigation would be considered inquiry project, but not research. So when we use the term qualitative research, we're actually referring to the systematicity and the rigor and the step-by-step plotted approach to the project. And down below I list for you two ways of talking about research that sort of put projects in opposition to one another. And what's funny about this is that in one of the things that contemplative inquiry helps us to do is to refuse any kind of simplistic dualism. So here we have traditional scientific research versus qualitative or interpretive research. And the truth is, any researcher can use contemplative techniques in preparing themselves for research and in preparing themselves for analysis and preparing themselves for writing. The one thing they wouldn't do is use contemplative methods as a method of collecting information, unless this becomes part of mixed methods research, and that's something for you to consider down the road. You're probably aware of some of the practices that might be included in contemplative inquiry just from studying qualitative research. Good qualitative researchers are reflective, that is, they bring attention to what they're doing, to their motives, to their interests, and to their relationship with their participants. So contemplative inquiry involves three broad groups of practices, and the one most familiar is reflective. So that's bringing active attention to self or others, typically on past experience or thinking. So if you were to examine your hidden agenda for doing research on children living in homeless shelters, it's important that you, as a researcher, are in touch with your beliefs, biases, hopes for that population and for the study that you're doing with them. The second group of techniques would be called contemplative, and so these might come from the wisdom traditions of multiple different cultures. Contemplation involves passive attention to self or others, whereas reflection is active, contemplation is passive. We think of meditation as a contemplative technique. We think of mindful walking or walking a labyrinth as contemplative. Some people consider prayer as contemplative. So passive attention to self or other, typically of present state or experiences, maybe sitting with the data until insights arise. So reading, being open, taking a moment to meditate, to inspire the creative awakening of synthesis of data, waiting for themes to emerge from qualitative interview data, for example. And then the third group of contemplative practices could be called the experiential, and that's movement. It has to do with the senses, outward action, use of the body. So this is where people engage in yoga or tai chi or some other kind of movement or dance practice to actually tune the research instrument. So in qualitative research, we say that the researcher themselves are the most important instruments. They're the instruments to gather and analyze data. All of these practices include active attention to sensation, emotion, and internal dialogue. So while there are foregrounding and backgrounding of activities, they all involve attention to what's happening in the present, even as we reflect on the past, actively, passively bring attention to the present, or experience the moment. So, and maybe that's separating things out into categories just for the sake of discussion, when really, like a lot of things in qualitative research, you'll see a blurring of lines, and you'll come to understand that different qualitative researchers will sort and categorize and delineate and define terms for the way that they use them for their convention in the work that they do, but other researchers will use different terms and imagine different relationships and organizations. On this slide, you get to see the tree of contemplative practices, and this comes from the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. I'm just thinking of a few practices that relate to qualitative inquiry, but these are the host of practices that this organization, anyway, has thought of that might be included in contemplative studies. So a broader field than what we're talking about here. We're talking about inquiry projects. What's funny about that is that contemplation, it does involve inquiry of all sorts, but we're talking about inquiry projects that move toward research in that they are focused, rigorous, systematic projects that are meant to generate some kind of academic report or a sharing of findings with participants. So we're using just a few of these, although you might find, if you use any of these, that they help you with your qualitative projects. If you look at the movement piece, you'll see yoga and dance and Tai Chi are there. If you look at the creative pieces, you'll see journaling, and everyone in education is familiar with journaling. If you see the stillness practices, there you have meditation. If you see generative, there you have beholding or visualization, and that might be used in the arts, for example. So maybe you're wondering why people might use contemplative inquiry in educational environments, and this slide includes a few responses to that question. Actually, people use contemplative inquiry in educational environments usually because contemplative techniques have somehow improved, or their work in other realms, or have benefited themselves in some way. But a few reasons here that you might try at least thinking about including contemplative inquiry techniques in your qualitative research is that it carries an ethic of compassion toward self and others. So if you're interested in working on justice-oriented projects, in projects that aim to help others, and sometimes we call this teacher action research, action research as a body that comes from South America, carries with it this idea that there's going to be some kind of social action at the end. If you're interested in feminist projects or using a feminist lens, if you're working with vulnerable populations. So contemplative inquiry includes in there an ethic of compassion. Going a step further, contemplative inquiry can be used in projects where a Freirean lens is also used. So this is about social consciousness raising. The first action that anyone takes in consciousness raising is in interrogating their own thoughts and finding out their own biases and working on raising their own consciousness. So it starts with liberating the self from oppressive beliefs. There's no way to do that unless you first tune in non-judgmentally and carefully pay attention to what's arising in the body and following the thoughts. And then you'll be able to uncover the root of belief systems. Oppressive beliefs aren't just cognitive, they're also affective. So you might learn about a history of oppression or oppressive systems academically, but it's going to be very hard for you to understand where you are caught up in those oppressive systems unless you investigate what's going on internally, not just your beliefs, but also the feelings in the body associated with those beliefs. If you've not studied Freire, I encourage you to check out these two terms, conscientization, and this is his idea of social consciousness raising, and also praxis, so reflection and action upon the world. So this is study and action, and he thinks of this term especially for teachers who are public intellectuals who take as their responsibility knowing something about the world and showing it to their students. So this is their practice and action. It has some action in the world. So teaching is an act, it's a political act, whether or not there's any outward social action going on like we might expect. So whether or not teachers are actively engaged in social protest, their teaching has some political meaning to it. If you're not familiar with Freire, you should be, because you can't understand qualitative research that's critical with understanding this kind of mission, especially in an educational context. So contemplative inquiry, moving even further, advances a radical reconceptualization of social change. So whereas Freire might be invoked for outward social action, contemplative inquiry reminds us that the locus of action is actually the inner processes. So as I was saying before, the structures of oppression are held in our tissues and held in our emotions. So there has to be some kind of internal working force first before we can deal with structural relationships, before we can deal with institutional conditions. And finally, as does all of qualitative research, contemplative inquiry offers a critique to Cartesianism. Now, Descartes is remembered most for his cogito ergo sum, meaning I think, therefore I am. Contemplative inquiry says that privileges the cognitive and forgets too much about the body, and in fact places the body in a subordinate position. Contemplative inquiry involves the cognitive and the empirical and the emotional. So contemplative inquiry, as does qualitative research more broadly, it rejects that split between body and mind. And here are a few more defenses. Contemplative inquiry includes practices that are shared by those who have experience with those who seek it. So, say if you were going into a research environment and one of your aims was to do something to improve the conditions of the people that you were studying, and this would be common of action-oriented research or change-oriented research or feminist or critical projects. Contemplative inquiry involves practices in working on yourself, but also includes practices that can be shared with others. So if you're including some mindfulness meditation or some yoga in the research process, that's something that you can engage in with the participants that you're working with. So it fits really well into a social dynamic. Now that's coming from the researcher to participant. It's also becoming more popular to study the contemplative techniques themselves. So placing contemplative practices as the object of research, studying school programs that use yoga or Tai Chi, studying school programs that use mindfulness. Contemplative inquiry includes practices that are non-dogmatic and adaptable to various interests, needs, and beliefs. So they're non-purist. They can be adapted for a variety of backgrounds and belief systems, age levels, ability levels, classroom environments. And so this is coming from both the use of contemplative techniques for the researcher themselves. There's no reason to have any particular kind of cultural background or belief or physical ability. And likewise, in studying contemplative techniques in educational environments, there's no need to look at the experience of these practices in just one kind of population. If you look back at the tree of contemplative studies, then you can imagine the variety of practices and context and populations that you could study. And then from Barbizet and Bergman, two quotes that I think have some merit and inclusion here. Contemplative inquiry creates an openness to unfamiliar knowledge and ways of knowing, engenders empathy, connection, and compassion, and enables clearer understanding by helping us recognize and articulate our pre-existing beliefs and biases. So this is what contemplative inquiry does in helping qualitative researchers. It's also concerned with transforming relationships, our understanding of the interpersonal, intrapersonal, and systemic influences and forces which shape our individual lives and society. And so this is a benefit to the researcher in their understanding of the relationships that are happening within the context that they're studying. And now I want to share with you a few applications of contemplative inquiry. And the examples here fall under a particular kind of contemplative inquiry called mindful inquiry. Mindful inquiry was conceived of by Benson Shapiro in 1998, and they wrote a book called Mindful Inquiry. And where some people might use mindful inquiry and contemplative inquiry interchangeably, mindful inquiry is a specific kind of methodology. It involves the Buddhist concept of mindfulness. This is their term, or being present in the moment, phenomenology, critical theory, and hermeneutics. And so the process of mindful inquiry is something that puts the researcher in the center of the research. So this is a kind of qualitative research that includes the researcher themselves in part of the study. So the collection of data, the analysis of data, and report of the findings is going to involve all the participants, including the researcher and their role in the project. And here are some examples. You go from the investigation of a particular researcher's experience in Nagata, where she does her dissertation work on an experience of culture shock, where she enters a Japanese context and she's investigating intercultural communication, but she's using herself as the primary informant in this study. And then Elizabeth Frias is a student that I've worked with. She's at the university. She's at Arizona State University. She defended her thesis last spring in 2015. And the title of her work is Mindfulness Practitioners in the Classroom, an Exploration of Lived Experiences. So she found teachers who had mindfulness practices, and she interviewed them about how their mindfulness practices affected their teaching. And she used the mindful inquiry techniques to help her in the analysis and framing of the work that she did. So these are both based on the work of Benson Shapiro. And finally, another student that is actively working on her dissertation is Stephanie Romero. She's at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm also on her committee. Her project is called Crossing the Border Between Lived Experience of and the Research on Mindfulness in Education, a Reflective Exploration. And Stephanie is a particular mindfulness practitioner. She follows the Shambhala tradition. It's Tibetan Buddhism. And so she is investigating how her own practice of Buddhism affects her teaching. And she's using Buddhist meditation practices as a way to gather data and analyze data and report findings. She is adapting Benson Shapiro's model and focusing more on the specific techniques of Buddhism as she interprets them. It's highly personal. In fact, all of these projects are highly personal. If you're interested in autobiographical, autoethnographic kind of work, then this is the stuff that would appeal to you. Moving into the more general categories that would be considered contemplative inquiry, I want to share with you the works of a few individuals. You have contemplative qualitative inquiry, and this comes from Valerie Jancic, and in 2015 she wrote a book called Contemplative Qualitative Inquiry, and here she is using Zen Buddhism as a lens by which to understand qualitative inquiry. So if you're interested more specifically in the application of Buddhism to qualitative research, then I recommend this book to you. There's meditation used as contemplative inquiry, and this is secular meditation, first-person critical inquiry. This comes from Arthur Zijonk, and he is a theoretical physicist and also a mindfulness practitioner. He teaches in Amherst at the University of Massachusetts, and he has written books and articles on loving kindness meditation. So he talks about meditation as a particular kind of inquiry. So he's framing meditation itself as a qualitative research project. The subject of this research is almost always on the self, but then it moves out also to relationships with people, and then the beliefs about the world and beliefs about social systems. And then there's body-oriented pedagogy, and someone I've been reading lately is Oren Ergus, and he's from Tel Aviv University in Israel. And he is talking more broadly about teaching and learning methodologies that involve the body. So he has written about Hatha Yoga, or the yoga postural practices, as embodied mindfulness. He says a dwelling within a preconceptual knowing based on acute awareness of sensations. So this would be teacher research, or research on practice, and it's using the body as a research tool and as the site of inquiry. And on this slide also I have the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. So if you're interested in more specific projects, this is rather new, I think just came out last year. Here's the place that you can go to read about the ways that qualitative researchers are framing their projects as contemplative inquiry, and also about projects that involve the study of people who are engaged in contemplative practices. This slide is very personal, has to do with the reasons that I do yoga and what yoga does for me as a researcher. And I just want to draw your attention to yoga as a self-care practice for a researcher. So the way that I think about yoga is as a preventative and a curative. So as an academic, as a researcher, someone connected to a university, I recognize that our work, the life in academia can be isolating, and the research projects that we engage in, the hours put in on reading, at staring at screens, at writing, it can be damaging to the body and the mind. Being slumped over at the computer, giving presentations, being on the road, traveling, that can be damaging. So yoga is a complete system of self-care where you're attending to the body and the mind and the breath. It's actually quite economical. So rather than collecting a variety of practices and then thinking about, well, how am I going to make it to the gym, or what's going to be my sports schedule, yoga kind of takes care of it all. And here I'm talking about a hatha practice, a practice that involves the body posture and breathing exercises. But it also involves a moving mindfulness meditation. So you've got breath work, you've got movement, which gives you all the benefits of exercise, and then you've got mindfulness, which gives you all the mental, psychological, and social benefits. Yoga as a practice is non-competitive, gentle, and it's self-care that's available to all bodies. And that's true of all of the contemplative techniques. I think yoga is so nice because it can be adaptable to any context, to any body system. There's always something new to be learned about yoga modifications. I recently found a practice of yoga for people with pulmonary hypertension, which is a disease that one of my best friends has. What yoga has done for me is made me more patient or flexible, resilient or strong, and steady in the face of challenges, balanced. So those are the three legs so to speak, of yoga and what yoga is after. What are the aims of yoga? Flexibility, strength, and balance, and that's in the mind and the body. Yoga provides me with a means of reflection and introspection from which I can adjust my research approaches. So when I need to step away from the data, when I need to drop the reading and the writing and the conferencing and the phone calls and the planning and sketching and organizing, doing yoga gives me a way to reflect and introspect on those projects. And later, I find that insights have arisen during that practice. If I can take time away and be present on my mat and move through my body, then things go much easier for me. I actually need less time and less energy at, quote, work when I do yoga regularly. Practicing yoga over the past 20 years has really laid bare my prejudices and assumptions, and that's prejudices and assumptions about myself primarily, about who I am in relation to other people, about other people as individuals, as other people as they belong to groups, relationships and organizations, arrangements of society. So as someone who is interested in critical pedagogy and social justice education, this is a real benefit to me. And plenty of people are writing now about the use of yoga and other forms of mindfulness in anti-oppressive pedagogy and educational work of all kinds. I recommend Beth Barilla if this is what excites you. Yoga opens my heart to my participant and makes me more compassionate. Listening is a skill that's absolutely essential for qualitative researchers. Observation, careful observation, developing rapport. So these are the kinds of skills that are developed through mindfulness practices. The one that served me the best has been yoga. And finally, I find that I'm a more attentive and responsive researcher because of yoga. So I can go into a research situation fully aware of my personal agenda, my hang-ups, my biases, and rather than seeing my participants as a means to an end, I can be with them, I can be present for them and responsive to them without getting hung up too much on my research plan and what I'm hoping to get from them. And this is a good hallmark, or the hallmark of a good qualitative research project is that it can be responsive and it can be adjustable to the needs of the participants that you're working with. And finally, I want to describe for you the current research project I'm involved with. This is a 2-year-long case study of an alternative school in a urban district in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My partner in this work is the director of Yoga in Schools, which is a nonprofit organization that teaches teachers how to use yoga in their classrooms and also directly teaches yoga classes to students. So the school district asked us to come in and study the program that we had designed for them in training the staff on how to use yoga techniques for their own self-care and for their students. So this school in particular was interested in how yoga might improve the skills for self-regulation and calming that these students need. So this is a high stress environment. All the students have uh, intense needs for behavioral support. So the entire school is arranged around that need for behavioral support. One of the things that is pretty common in educational environments, whether it's teaching or research, is that there's usually a cultural divide between the teacher or researcher or administrator and the school population. And when you're talking about a behavioral support alternative school in an urban district, it's even more stark. So the majority of the teachers in this particular school are white. There's more men in the school than you might typically find. And the researchers, myself and my research partner, are white women. Even more so, we're educated and I would say upper working class to lower middle class women. So the students here are almost 100% African American and about 80% male. So you see the difference there, and there has to be some influence of that particular arrangement, that power differential, that cultural divide, the gender divide, the economic divide, the educational divide. That has to be taken into consideration in the as a variable in the research and in the program and what's going on in the environment. So we're in particular interested in studying the relationships that are happening in this research environment, relationships between ourselves and the teachers, ourselves and the administration, ourselves and the students, between the teachers and the administrators, between the teachers and the students and the students. People that are interested primarily in relationships are often attracted to a feminist lens. So when you think about the importance of the differences in culture and gender and class and race, and you're also interested in relationships, then feminism is usually a helpful framework for you. So we're developing a way to talk about the research that we're doing and describing it as using a yogic lens. So it's a particular feminist relational lens which acknowledges that relationships are paramount to our understanding of yoga in schools and to signal that we are operating under a strong ethic of care. And check out the work of Nell Noddings if you're interested in an ethic of care. And what that means is that rather than thinking of care simply as a responsibility that someone in power has to someone with less power, this is about a mutual relationship of the one caring and the one being cared for. So this is reciprocal in that the people occupy the role of carer and cared for, and this moves back and forth. And the idea is that this ethic informs you of how to behave in a relationship independent of what you feel personally about the person involved in this relationship for you. So there's natural caring, which happens between parents and children and loved ones and people who are in intimate relationships. And then there's ethical caring, which is the responsibility that you have in the role of either one caring or cared for. An ethic of care relies on you to draw on your ethical ideal self. So what are the things that you would do ideally in a relationship of natural care? You draw on that to inform your actions and the decisions that you make in this relationship of ethical care, so that you can have a caring relationship with anyone, independent of how you feel about them personally or how much you know about them. It requires you to be involved in their needs in the particular moment without sacrificing your own needs in that relationship. And I think too often when we talk about caring and teaching, we think about all of the responsibility being with a teacher, that they should care selflessly. But that's a destructive kind of way to be, and it certainly isn't yogic. So a yogic lens relies on an ethic of care, which always involves taking care of the self as well. Again, please see Nell Noddings if you're at all interested in an ethic of care. So this yogic lens is further informed by the yamas and niyamas, which are ethical disciplines. And in particular, in this study, what we're drawing on are the yogic yamas. So this is a set of principles for how you should behave. And we've interpreted them as doing no harm, being truthful, not comparing our performance with others, keeping our work in balance without overreaching, and working on ourselves as we radiate the fruits of our work to the world. And see, these sound like principles that people observe while they're doing yoga, and they are. And we find that they're necessary in order for us to enact an ethical relationship in our research project as well. So this respects ourselves and the people that we're working with, and gives us a check on our reliability and trustworthiness. So when you start talking about validity in qualitative research, which is a pretty a slippery concept, very contentious, much debated, and you're looking for a check on trustworthiness in your project, this would be an example of one of our checks of trustworthiness. So our claim is that a yogic approach to research is a just fit, and just meaning justice-oriented, for inquiry projects or program evaluation on yoga programs, especially those serving historically marginalized populations in public schools. So just like any university-based IRB shares with you the NIH's position on requiring extra care for vulnerable populations, what we find is that research projects that involved vulnerable populations, and from a critical perspective, historically marginalized populations are always vulnerable because they always have less power, less political and social power, and usually cultural power as well. That this ethical, relational, yogic approach is a just fit for studying these kinds of projects, these populations. Even more so when the thing that you're studying is the experience of these populations with learning and doing yoga. This final slide just includes for you a few links to some professional organizations and research centers where you can get more information about contemplative inquiry. And that's the Association for Mindfulness in Education, the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. They're the ones that sponsor the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. The Garrison Institute, Kripalu Institute for Extraordinary Living, and the Mindfulness in Education Network. That's a very useful listserv if you're interested in the projects that people are doing, and if you want some support in the dissertation work that you'll be doing if it involves mindfulness of any kind. So be sure to check out the related YouTube video that includes a suggested mindfulness practice appropriate for any level of practice. What I have in mind designing this is for the educational research who is about to embark on about to embark in dissertation study. So what this last slide shows are just a few links of professional organizations for you. The Association for Mindfulness in Education, the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. They're the ones that sponsor the Journal for Contemplative Inquiry. The Garrison Institute, lots of retreats are happening there. Kripalu Institute for Extraordinary Living. They're the ones that run Yoga in the Schools research symposiums, and the Mindfulness in Education Network. That's a listserv for people who are engaged in mindfulness inquiry projects. Usually they're teaching and studying mindfulness in schools. And if you're interested in doing mindfulness inquiry or a research project, this is a good network to belong to find colleagues, peers, mentors, and research subjects. Be sure to check out the related YouTube video that demos for you a mindfulness practice. This is just a simple introductory mindfulness meditation technique that I hope you find useful.